independence, and accountability. We know that we want high-quality judges who are fair and even-tempered, but how do we identify and hire these judges? First, we need to decide who ought to choose our judges, and who, if anyone, should be able to decide whether the judges keep their jobs. We might have lawyers choose. Lawyers know about the law, and they know what it takes to make a good judge. They deal with judges on a regular basis. Because we choose judges from the ranks of attorneys, lawyers would already have a network of potential candidates. They might be in a good position to identify those among them who would do well as a judge. Of course, lawyers also have to appear in the courtrooms of the judges quite regularly, so while it might make sense to have lawyers involved in choosing the judges, it might be a problem to have them be responsible for deciding which judges get to keep their jobs. We could just have other judges decide. Indeed, many other countries around the world rely heavily on judges to pick their own colleagues. Who knows more about judging than the judges? Probably nobody. And the judges also know a lot of lawyers, so they would have a network of potential judicial candidates. But this might not be a great way to breathe life and diversity into the judiciary. Judges are likely to choose new judges who are like themselves, in terms of political views, demographics, and even social circles. So letting the judges decide might perpetuate the status quo in the judiciary. Also, this would give the judges an awful lot of power. This would be especially true if we allowed judges to fire one another. What if we were to go a different route and allow politicians to decide? Judges are a part of government, after all. Politicians make and enforce the law, so maybe they know a thing or two about it. Many of them have been to law school, and a good portion of them have practiced as lawyers. This might provide some kind of balance between the powers of the branches, but it might also make the judiciary subservient to the other branches of government, especially if politicians get to choose which judges keep their jobs. But if we're hoping to channel the will of the people, we might just ask the people to decide. Voters might not have as much information about the ins and outs of judging, but the voters could certainly try to choose judges that share the community's values about certain issues. But voters might have a difficult time making nuanced decisions about judges. Also, if the people get to choose which judges keep their jobs, then the judges might be subject to the whims of public opinion. Or we could just create a bureaucratic team to choose our judges. Many civil law countries do this, as their judiciary is essentially part of the bureaucracy. We might get a group of experts together whose job it is to determine which lawyers should be judges and which judges should be promoted or fired. So how do we decide who should choose our judges? Well, it depends. There are versions of all of these systems in operation around the world. Which one we choose depends largely on how we see the role of the judge in the political system. We need to think not only about what kind of person we want as a judge, but also what kind of role the judge should play. The most important consideration we have in terms of judicial role is the balance between accountability and independence. On the one hand is accountability. Accountability means that judges are not free to do as they please, but that they can be held responsible for their decisions. Remember, the decisions judges make have an impact in our world. They can certainly change the lives of the litigants. So people who argue for accountability believe that society must retain some sort of control over which judges stay on the bench. Most of us would agree that this is important, at least to some extent. But what should we hold judges responsible for? I think we can all agree that there should be a way to get rid of judges who break the law or accept bribes. We need to be able to remove judges who exhibit bad behavior that rises to the level of crime. But what about incompetence? Should we be able to remove a judge who, say, falls asleep on the bench? Or a judge who doesn't understand the law very well? Or who cannot keep control of a courtroom? What about judges who make decisions that we don't like? Should we be able to get rid of those judges? Take the case of Daniel Tavares of Massachusetts. He pled guilty to manslaughter for the murder of his own mother in 1992. While in prison, he made the acquaintance of racist gangs and other charming folks. He also sent death threats to his own father and to Governor Romney, among other people. He had a habit of assaulting people in prison. Just before his release from prison, prosecutors charged him with some of these assaults. The lower court judge ordered $100,000 bail, but Superior Court Judge Kathy Tutman overturned the bail, releasing him on his own recognizance and without GPS. He was ordered to meet with a probation officer 3 times a week, but he only showed up once before he skipped town. Fast forward a couple of months, and Mr. Tavares has murdered a lovely young couple in another state. Observers were dumbfounded by Judge Tuttman's decision to release him. Governor Romney said, "The judge showed an inexplicable lack of good judgment in a hearing that decided to put someone on the street who had not only in the past been convicted of manslaughter, but who had threatened the lives of other individuals and was a flight risk." Of course, it was Governor Romney who had appointed her in the first place. But Tuttman declined to retire or resign, and is still serving on the Superior Court in Massachusetts. Citizens lamented the fact that they were unable to hold her accountable for what they saw as her lack of judgment. But Tavares is now back in prison, so you can sleep a little better now, as long as you're not in prison with him. But to whom should judges be accountable? How do we deal with making sure the judges we pick are good ones, and making sure that we get the bad ones off the bench? We could set up a judicial discipline board, and we might staff it with lawyers or other judges. Or should we let politicians decide? Maybe we could appoint judges for a fixed term and allow politicians to decide whether to reappoint the judges. Or we might just have the voters decide by subjecting judges to periodic elections. But this desire to hold judges accountable is in direct conflict with another important goal, which is to maintain the independence of our judges. Why do we need judges to be independent? Well, we rely on them to make decisions that are sometimes unpopular. If we assume that their decisions are at least guided by what the law and the Constitution require, then we need them to have the freedom to follow the law, regardless the wishes of the other branches of government or the people. It is pretty clear that the Reconstruction-era amendments were intended to curb discrimination based on race. But early on, the court declined to interpret it this way. It wasn't until the 1950s that the court finally required states to stop discrimination based on race. In Brown v. Board of Education, the court declared that maintaining segregation was a constitutional violation. But the decision at the time was quite unpopular, especially in the South. Had the judges been facing re-election, it seems much less likely that they would have been able to make the decision that has since become one of the most important in the Supreme Court's history. Judges, in order to make these types of principled but unpopular decisions, need to be independent. But independent from whom? Certainly they must be independent from the litigants who appear before them. They also need independence from the other branches of government as well as public opinion. Now that we've been introduced to the ideas of accountability and independence, it's clear that they are in conflict with one another. In order to maximize accountability, we would necessarily compromise judicial independence. But to maximize independence is to compromise accountability. So how does the federal judicial selection system balance these two? We find a hint in the Declaration of Independence. Here, among the list of grievances, we find a little something about judges. The Declaration complains that the king has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. In other words, the framers of the Constitution were concerned about the lack of independence in the existing system. Indeed, the system laid out in the Constitution is heavily weighted toward independence. The president nominates a candidate with the advice and consent of the Senate, so the politicians do have significant influence over who is chosen to fill the federal judiciary. But after that, the politicians have very little control. They can impeach judges for high crimes and misdemeanors, but other than that, there is no formal mechanism to hold judges accountable once they are on the bench. As such, we have a relatively independent federal judiciary. Of course, that begs the question, what do we do when one of the judges turns out not to be so great? Well, we wait. We wait for them to retire or die.